The air hung heavy with the scent of magnolias and impending rain, the kind that clings to the skin like a shroud on that sultry evening in the antebellum South. The grand plantation house loomed against the twilight sky, its white columns glowing faintly under lanterns strung like fireflies across the veranda. Laughter spilled from within, mingling with the distant croak of frogs from the encroaching woods, a dense, tangled wilderness that seemed to breathe with secrets of its own. Enslaved hands had toiled under the relentless sun to prepare for this night, the wedding banquet of the master's daughter, a union meant to bind two powerful families in a web of cotton and cruelty. In the sweltering kitchen, detached from the main house like an afterthought, moved a figure cloaked in shadows. Her name was whispered only in hushed tones among her kin. Elara, the cook whose skilled hands had fed the household for years, masking bitterness in every savory bite. Her dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, flickered over the simmering pots and laden trays. The aroma of roasted meats and spiced gravies masked something subtler, a faint, acrid undernote that no one else detected. Years of lashes and lost freedoms had carved deep lines into her soul, each scar a testament to the quiet rage simmering beneath her composed exterior. As the first guests arrived, their silks rustling like dry leaves, Elara carried out the platters with a deference that belied the storm within. The banquet hall buzzed with merriment, crystal glasses clinking, voices rising in toasts to prosperity built on broken backs. But outside, the woods stirred. A low wind rustled the ancient oaks, carrying faint murmurs that sounded almost like words, echoes from a forgotten past urging her onward. She paused at the threshold, feeling the pull of those invisible threads, the air growing thicker, charged with an unseen malice. Little did the revelers know, as they savored the first forkfuls under the chandelier's glow, that the feast was laced with vengeance, a slow, insidious toxin drawn from roots hidden deep in the forest's heart. The night promised joy, but the darkness encroaching from the trees whispered of horror, of retribution uncoiling like a serpent in the underbrush, ready to strike at the very soul of the gathering. In the sweltering heat of the Mississippi Delta, beneath the sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss, stood Willow Ridge Plantation, a kingdom of white gold built on black suffering. The year was 1842, and the air buzzed with anticipation that felt almost obscene to those who toiled in silence. The master's only daughter, Miss Evangeline, was to wed the son of a neighboring planter, a union that would merge two vast empires of cotton and further tighten the chains that bound hundreds of souls. For weeks, the enslaved community had been pressed into frantic labor. Fields were neglected as hands were diverted to scrub the great house until it gleamed, to polish silver that had never known their own reflection, to stitch delicate lace for a bride who had never once learned their names. The big house overflowed with preparations. Bolts of silk arrived from New Orleans, crates of French wine were unloaded under the watchful eye of the overseer, and musicians, borrowed from another plantation, practiced reels that would dance across the polished floors while aching feet in the quarters dared not tap in rhythm. In the detached kitchen, a low brick building smothered in chimney smoke and the scent of rendering fat, Elara moved like a shadow among shadows. She had been the head cook since she was barely 14, taken from her mother's side and thrust into the heat of the hearth because her hands were quick and her palate keen. Over the decades she had learned to turn meager rations into feasts that earned grudging praise from the master's table, each compliment a bitter pill that fed the quiet fire inside her. She knew every herb in the garden, every root that could heal or harm, every secret the land kept from those who claimed to own it. One evening, as she carried a heavy tray of cooled peach preserves toward the pantry, fragments of conversation drifted through the open dining room windows. The master's voice, thick with brandy and satisfaction, boasted of the coming wedding, 3 days of celebration, guests arriving from as far as Charleston and Nat Shea, a banquet that would be spoken of for years. His wife laughed about the menu: roasted quail, oyster patties, a towering bride's cake laced with rum, and how it would display their wealth to every important family in the state. Elara paused in the darkness just beyond the lantern light, the tray balanced on her hip growing heavier with each word. The laughter from within sliced deeper than any whip ever had. This wedding was not merely a marriage, it was a monument to everything stolen from her, her childhood, her family scattered across auction blocks, the child she had born and lost to fever while the mistress fretted over silk patterns. Every dish she would prepare would pass through hands that had known only cruelty from those who would consume it. In that moment, beneath the indifferent stars, Something shifted inside her like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. The wedding banquet would be lavish, unforgettable, perfect. And she would make certain of it. The resentment that had simmered for years crystallized into a single, cold resolve. This celebration of their power would become the instrument of her retribution, served on silver platters with her own steady hands. As the days blurred into weeks of frantic preparation, Elara found herself slipping away from the plantation under the cover of twilight more often than before. The resolve that had crystallized in her heart that fateful evening now demanded action, a meticulous gathering of the tools for her vengeance. The woods beyond Willow Ridge, those ancient, whispering oaks that bordered the cotton fields like silent sentinels, held what she needed: secrets buried in the damp earth and tangled undergrowth that only someone attuned to the land's hidden rhythms could unearth. She knew these paths from childhood, when her mother had taught her the dual language of the forest: plants that healed fevers and eased birthing pains, and those that brought silent, agonizing ends. Rat poison was too crude, too traceable for the whites who feared it most. Arsenic lingered in the blood and screamed accusation from autopsies. No, Elara sought subtler allies: roots and leaves that mimicked the grip of summer ague or the twist of bad whiskey, things that could fell a man slowly while the revelry masked the first cramps. Under the waning moon, she ventured deeper than the overseer's patrols dared, her bare feet silent on the leaf-strewn floor. First came the manchineel sap, milky and burning, harvested with gloved hands from low branches she marked years ago. A drop in gravy could blister the throat from within. Then the white snakeroot, its clusters trembling in the breeze, known to taint milk and meat with a trembling sickness that built over hours. She dug carefully around jimsonweed, its thorny pods yielding seeds that clouded the mind and seized the heart, perfect for a feast where wine already loosened tongues. But the true prize lay in the shadowed hollows: oleander leaves, boiled down to a bitter concentrate that promised convulsions and stillness. Elara tested her harvest with grim precision on the fringes of the property, scattering small doses in scraps for the feral hogs that rooted near the river, watching from afar as they staggered and fell, noting how long the agony lasted, how the symptoms unfolded like a slow unraveling. One boar took hours to succumb, foaming at the mouth in a way that could pass for rabies or tainted water. Another collapsed mid-feast, mirroring the sudden drops she envisioned at the banquet table. Each expedition carried risk: the crack of a twig might summon dogs or a watchful field hand turned informer, but the pull was inexorable. Back in the dim quarters at dawn, she ground and distilled in secret, hiding vials in the hollow of a gnarled cypress stump, her hand steady despite the sweat beading on her brow. The woods seemed to aid her, vines parting like curtains, nocturnal creatures falling silent as she passed. With every bundle tucked into her apron, the plan sharpened: a dash in the punch, a glaze on the meats, an infusion in the towering wedding cake that would crown the night. The resentment that fueled her grew tangible now, woven into these deadly harvests. This was no rash fury but a calculated harvest of retribution, drawn from the very earth the masters claimed to own yet barely understood. As the wedding day approached, Elara's gatherings intensified, her knowledge transforming the encroaching wilderness into an arsenal, ready to turn celebration into catastrophe. The night before the wedding dawned heavy with storm clouds rolling in from the Gulf, turning the air thick and electric as if the sky itself held its breath. Elara had spent the day in a frenzy of commanded activity, directing younger hands to churn butter until their arms ached, to glaze hams with molasses drawn from barrels that bore the scars of countless voyages, to layer the towering bride's cake with rum-soaked sponge that would soon absorb far more than sweetness. The great house pulsed with anticipation, servants scurrying like shadows under the chandeliers being polished to a merciless gleam, while outside, carriages began to arrive, their wheels churning red clay into mud that clung like blood to the hems of fine gowns. As twilight bled into darkness, the kitchen fell into an unnatural quiet once the last trays were carried out for cooling. The fires banked low, casting long, flickering shadows across the brick walls slick with grease and steam. Elara remained alone, wiping her hands on a rag that had long since turned grey from use, her breath steady despite the thunder rumbling closer. She moved to the heavy iron pot still simmering on the hearth, lifting the lid to stir the rich gravy meant for the roasted quail, a sauce praised in advance by the mistress for its depth of flavor. In that solitary moment, with the plantation asleep in exhausted preparation, a whisper threaded through the crackle of dying embers. It came not from the wind rattling the shutters nor from any human throat, but from the darkness itself, low and insistent, like a voice rising from the earth beneath the floorboards. "Now," it murmured, brushing against her ear like cool fingers on fevered skin. "The time ripens. They feast on your labor, let them taste what has been sown in tears." Elara froze, her spoon suspended, heart pounding against her ribs as the words coiled deeper, revealing fragments of forgotten lore, precise measures to blend the oleander concentrate with the snakeroot tincture, how the jimsonweed would cloud judgment before the final seizure, ensuring the toxin spread slowly, inexorably, through every vein at the table. The voice grew clearer, almost maternal, echoing memories of her own mother's hushed teachings in stolen moments by candlelight, warnings wrapped in remedies that the whites had dismissed as superstition. It urged her onward, promising that the woods had watched her harvests, that the roots she had gathered pulsed with the same ancient fury now stirring in her blood. No longer mere instinct, the plan sharpened into certainty. The poison would mimic the excesses of gluttony and wine, turning toasts into gasps, laughter into convulsions under the watchful eyes of ancestors unseen. Elara's hands did not tremble as she portioned the final infusions, dividing them carefully among the dishes set aside for the morrow, the punch bowl that would quench aristocratic thirsts, the gravies and glazes for the meats, the delicate filling between the cake's layers. The whisper faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving only the distant roll of thunder and the scent of impending rain mingling with the deadly aromas rising from her work. Yet its echo lingered in her mind, a dark affirmation that she was not alone in this act, that the night itself conspired with her, binding the feast to fates long overdue. As lightning flashed through the small window, illuminating her resolute face for an instant, the kitchen seemed to hold its breath with her, waiting for the storm to break both outside and within the grand hall come dawn. The morning of the wedding broke with a deceptive clarity, the storm clouds of the previous night scattered like fleeing conspirators, leaving the sky a hard, merciless blue. By dawn, the plantation hummed with final preparations, carriages lined the drive, liveried drivers lounging beneath the oaks while guests in crisp linens and silks descended to exchange pleasantries laced with the casual cruelty of ownership. Inside the great house, mirrors reflected endless motion, flowers arranged in crystal vases, tables extended beneath damask cloths, place settings of silver and porcelain gleaming like weapons. In the kitchen, heat already pressed against the walls as fires roared back to life. Elara directed the chaos with quiet authority, her voice low but unyielding as she assigned tasks, boys to turn spits heavy with quail and suckling pig, girls to whisk sauces and pipe rosettes onto the bride's cake towering on its silver stand. No one dared question her. Years had taught them that her calm masked an iron will. Yet today her movements carried an unnatural precision, each gesture measured as she moved between stations, tasting here, adjusting there, her eyes flicking toward the small clay vials hidden beneath a folded towel on the lowest shelf. The overseer, Mr. Hargrove, a thin, sun-reddened man whose eyes missed little, lingered longer than usual near the doorway, boot heels scraping the brick floor. He had heard rumors of unrest in the quarters, whispers of runaways to the north, and his suspicions settled on the kitchen like dust. He watched Elara ladle the rich brown gravy over the roasted meats, noting how her back never fully turned to him, how her spoon stirred with deliberate slowness. "Mind you don't overseason, girl," he drawled, leaning against the frame. "Master wants his guests praising his table, not clutching their bellies." Elara inclined her head in practiced deference, murmuring assent while her pulse thrummed steady beneath the surface. When Hargrove finally sauntered away to inspect the grounds, she worked swiftly. Into the vast punch bowl destined for the veranda went the first measure, a cloudy infusion of oleander and snakeroot that dissolved into the ruby depths of claret and citrus like a secret swallowed whole. The gravies received their share next, dark rivers absorbing the manchineel essence until they shone with deceptive richness. Glazes for the hams took the jimsonweed concentrate, brushed on in thin, even strokes that would caramelize under the final torching. And the cake, layer upon layer of sponge already soaked in rum, welcomed the finest distillation between its fillings, a pale cream that masked every trace of bitterness. Her hands did not shake. Not when younger cooks brushed past her, not when the clatter of trays rose around her, not even when the scent of the poisons mingled faintly with rosemary and browning butter. Each addition was exact, calibrated from nights of watching hogs falter and fall, timed to unfold slowly amid wine and laughter. As the first laden trays were lifted by waiting servers, faces schooled into impassive masks, Ilara stepped back into the shadows near the hearth, wiping her fingers clean on her apron. The kitchen emptied in waves, dishes borne toward the banquet hall where music already drifted like smoke. She remained a moment longer, eyes fixed on the swinging door, the weight of what she had done settling over her like the heat rising from the coals, steady and consuming. The wedding day unfolded in a blaze of splendor, the great lawn transformed into a vision of southern excess, white tents billowing like sails, tables groaning under silver epergnes bursting with hothouse roses, the air thick with the perfume of jasmine and the sharper tang of anticipation. Carriages discharged guests in waves, planters in tailored broadcloth, their wives in gowns of watered silk that caught the sunlight like rippling water, children darting between legs with forbidden excitement. Musicians tuned fiddles on the veranda while liveried boys circulated with trays of minted juleps frosted in silver cups. Laughter rose in bright cascades, toasts already flowing to the bride's beauty and the groom's prospects, as if the world beyond the white columns held no shadow. Inside the banquet hall, crystal chandeliers scattered prisms across the long tables, each place marked with cards penned in elegant copperplate. The feast began with military precision oysters on crushed ice, delicate patties bursting with shrimp and spice, soups served in porcelain so fine it seemed translucent. Ilara watched from the half-open service door, her figure half concealed by steam and shadow, as platters she had touched were borne in triumph to the tables. Servers moved in practiced silence, faces blank as masks, refilling glasses that never seemed to empty. The first subtle signs came cloaked in the ordinary chaos of celebration. A matron from Nat Shea fanned herself vigorously, complaining of the heat though a breeze stirred the curtains. A young lieutenant laughed too loudly at his own jest, then pressed a hand to his temple as if dizzy from the sun he had not seen in hours. Whispers threaded through the room, someone remarking on the punch's unusual bite, another joking that the claret must be stronger than usual this year. In the corner, a cluster of men debated politics with rising heat, their gestures growing sharper, words slurring though the afternoon was yet young. Outside, the woods pressed closer than memory allowed. Ancient oaks leaned as if listening, their mossy beards swaying though no wind touched the lawn. Guests strolling the gardens paused at odd moments, heads tilting toward the tree line where shadows pooled deeper than the sunlight should permit. One bridesmaid swore she saw a figure at the edge, tall, indistinct, gone when she blinked. Another guest, stepping onto the veranda for air, felt the hairs rise on his neck as a fleeting silhouette darted between trunks, too swift for deer or dog. At the head table, the bride glowed in lace and pearls, her groom raising yet another toast while the master beamed with proprietary pride. Yet even there, unease flickered, a cousin wiping sweat from his brow though the room was shaded, the mistress pressing fingers to her throat as if something lodged there. Conversation ebbed and flowed like a tide pulling back before a storm, laughter ringing a fraction too shrill. Ilara's gaze remained steady from her vantage, taking in each flushed cheek, each glass raised and drained, the slow bloom of confusion beneath the merriment. The hall's warmth seemed to thicken, the air growing heavy with more than perfume and wine, while beyond the windows the woods watched in patient silence, branches stirring as though murmuring approval of what had only just begun. The banquet hall reached its crescendo of revelry just as the sun dipped behind the oaks, casting long golden shafts through the tall windows that danced across flushed faces and glittering glassware. The master rose at the head table, his voice booming with practiced authority as he lifted a crystal goblet filled with the deep crimson punch, proposing a toast to his daughter's future, a future built on the endless rows of cotton that stretched beyond the lawn like a white sea. Laughter swelled in approval, glasses clinking in a bright chorus, the musicians striking up a lively reel that sent skirts swirling and boots stamping on the polished floor. It began with the groom's uncle, a portly planter from upriver whose cheeks already glowed from hours of indulgence. Mid-sentence in a bawdy anecdote that had the table roaring, his words faltered. The goblet slipped from his thick fingers, shattering against the porcelain plate with a sound sharp as a gunshot. He clutched at his chest, eyes widening in confusion more than pain, a ragged gasp escaping as he slumped forward into the untouched slice of bride's cake before him. For a heartbeat the room held its breath, the laughter hanging suspended like smoke, before a woman's nervous giggle broke the silence. Surely the heat, surely too much wine, surely a faint from the excitement. Servants rushed forward with practiced efficiency, loosening his cravat, fanning his face with napkins, while the master barked for air and water. But even as they propped the man upright, his color drained to ash, lips tinged an unnatural blue. Whispers rippled outward like circles in still water. Apoplexy, perhaps, or a weak heart strained by rich food. The bride laughed it off with forced brightness, urging the musicians to play louder, and the feast continued, forks spearing quail glazed to perfection, spoons dipping into gravies that carried a faint, unfamiliar warmth down eager throats. From her shadowed post near the service door, Ilara observed without expression, her hands folded beneath her apron as if in prayer. She noted each detail, the way the fallen man's fingers twitched once, then stilled, how the mistress pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, eyes darting nervously, how no one yet connected the collapse to the plates still being passed with courteous smiles. The poison worked as she had calculated, slow enough for denial, subtle enough to mimic excess, allowing the celebration to crest before the true unraveling began. Another guest, a young bridesmaid whose laughter had rung clearest moments before, suddenly swayed in her chair, her fan dropping to the floor as she murmured something about the room spinning. A cousin across the table coughed once, sharply, then again, deeper, as if something lodged beyond reach. Conversation faltered in pockets, replaced by uncertain glances and half-formed questions. Yet the inertia of merriment held, glasses were refilled, toasts attempted anew, the orchestra soaring frantically to drown the growing unease. In the flickering candlelight, faces gleamed with sweat that had nothing to do with summer heat, eyes beginning to glaze as the toxins threaded deeper into blood and breath. Ilara remained motionless, her gaze steady on the unfolding tableau, watching the first threads of panic weave through the tapestry of their triumph while the woods outside pressed closer, branches scraping faintly against the panes like fingers testing a locked door. The banquet hall, once a symphony of clinking crystal and bright voices, fractured into chaos as the groom's uncle lay motionless amid the wreckage of his plate, his face frozen in a grimace that no amount of fanning could soften. What had begun as a single collapse now multiplied like shadows at dusk. The young bridesmaid who had swayed moments earlier slid from her chair with a soft thud, her silk gown pooling around her like spilled cream, eyes rolling back as convulsions gripped her slender frame. Across the table, a Charleston merchant clutched his throat, coughing violently as if drowning on dry land, his wife screaming his name while pounding futilely on his back. One by one, guests staggered, some slumping forward into half-eaten plates, others reeling backward to crash against chairs that toppled like felled trees. Panic erupted in jagged waves. Women shrieked, clutching at one another as they backed away from the tables, skirts tangling in frantic retreat. Men shouted conflicting orders, fetch a doctor, open the windows, carry the afflicted outside, while the musicians faltered mid-note, bows scraping discordantly before falling silent. The master bellowed above the din, his face purpling with rage and fear, demanding to know what devilry had struck his house on this of all days. Servants froze in doorways, trays trembling in their hands, eyes wide with the knowledge that suspicion would soon turn toward them as it always did when misfortune visited the white tables. Accusations flew like sparks from a struck flint. The mistress, pale as the lace at her throat, pointed a shaking finger at the punch bowl, declaring the claret must have turned, though bottles from the same crate still passed untouched among the less afflicted. A planter from Natchez swore it was apoplexy brought on by excitement, refusing to believe anything more sinister even as his own vision blurred at the edges. Another guest, face slick with sweat, muttered about tainted oysters rushed from the coast, while the bride wept hysterically in her father's arms, her veil askew, the groom attempting to shield her though his own steps had grown unsteady. The master's gaze swept the room like a scythe, settling at last on the cluster of enslaved servers huddled near the service door. "You lot," he roared, voice cracking with fury. "What have you done?" Hargrove the overseer pushed forward, pistol drawn from his coat, herding the kitchen staff into the hall with barked threats, his eyes wild as he searched their faces for guilt. Whispers of poison rippled through the remaining guests, growing louder, more certain, as another body convulsed on the floor and the stench of vomit began to mingle with the cloying sweetness of spilled cake and wine. From the deepening shadows beyond the doorway, Ilara watched the unraveling with an stillness that bordered on serenity, her breath shallow and even amid the storm. The hall's grandeur now mocked itself, chandeliers swaying from the press of bodies, flowers crushed under heedless boots, The bride's cake toppled and smeared across damask like a sacrificial offering. Outside, thunder growled anew as clouds reclaimed the sky, and the woods seemed to lean closer, branches clawing at the windows as if eager to witness the full measure of retribution unfolding within the flickering light. As the screams echoed through the shattered hall and bodies littered the floor like discarded dolls. One survivor, a distant cousin from Charleston, his face ashen and veins burning with the poison's fire, pushed past the throng of panicked guests and staggered out into the night. His legs carried him blindly toward the tree line, away from the lantern's glare and the master's furious commands, driven by an instinct deeper than reason. The storm had broken fully now, rain lashing sideways in sheets that blurred the world into gray, soaking his fine coat until it clung heavy as chains. He collapsed at the edge of the lawn, retching into the mud, but even as cramps twisted his gut, faint voices rose on the wind, not the cries from the house behind him, but something older, murmuring from the depths of the woods. They called without words, a chorus of whispers that pulled at his fading strength, promising revelation or perhaps absolution in the darkness. Compelled, he crawled forward, branches whipping his face as he plunged into the undergrowth where no guest had ventured, the plantation's boundary dissolving into tangled vines and ancient roots that seemed to part just enough for his passage. Deeper in, where moonlight pierced the canopy in silver shards, the voices grew clearer, women's tones layered with sorrow and defiance, echoing names long erased from ledgers, recounting whippings and separations, births stolen and lives bartered. The ground softened under him, leading to a hollow ringed by gnarled cypress knees rising like sentinels from black water. There, half buried in moss and decay, lay remnants of what the land remembered but the big house denied, rusted iron collars tangled in roots, fragments of clay pots etched with forbidden marks, a child's tiny bone button glinting in the rain. The sight pulsed with the weight of untold atrocities, the clearing where runaways had been hunted, where mothers mourned children sold away, where the earth itself had absorbed blood and tears for generations. As the survivor reached out a trembling hand, touching the cold metal of a shackle half swallowed by the soil, visions flooded him. Faces of the enslaved staring back through time, their eyes holding the same quiet rage that had fueled the feast's undoing. The poison in his blood mirrored the slow rot of the plantation's lies, the facade of civility crumbling like the bodies back at the tables. Elara, still unseen in the chaos she had wrought, felt the woods stir in response, the ancient voices swelling as if welcoming another witness to their truth. The survivor gasped, realization dawning amid the agony that the banquet's horror was no accident but a reckoning rooted deep in this forsaken ground, where the land guarded secrets of cruelty that prosperity had tried to bury. Rain pounded harder, washing mud over the relics as thunder masked the distant wails from Willow Ridge, the forest closing ranks around the hollow, drawing the man's faltering breath into its eternal vigil while the night's vengeance spread unchecked. Amid the wreckage of the banquet hall, where overturned chairs and shattered crystal lay like the aftermath of a battle no one had seen coming, Elara stepped from the shadows at last. The storm raged outside, rain hammering the roof in relentless fury, lightning illuminating the grotesque tableau in stark flashes, bodies twisted in final agony, faces contorted in the realization that had come too late. Servants cowered in corners, Hargrove's pistol wavering as he barked futile orders, while the master stood frozen at the head table, his daughter sobbing against his blood-stained coat. Elara moved with deliberate calm through the chaos, her apron still tied, hands clean now of flour and poison alike. Eyes followed her, some in terror, some in dawning comprehension, but none dared bar her path. She approached the master directly, the man who had owned her body since childhood, who had sold her sister north and buried her infant son in an unmarked grave while mourning a favorite hound with greater ceremony. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost risen from the floorboards, his mouth working soundlessly, the poison already threading its slow fire through his veins. She stopped mere feet from him, close enough to see the sweat beading on his brow, the tremor in his hands as he clutched the table's edge for support. No words passed her lips, none were needed. The air between them crackled with every unspoken lash, every midnight separation, every forced smile over decades of servitude. His knees buckled first, a slow crumpling that mirrored the decay she had watched consume the plantation's grandeur, the peeling paint hidden by fresh whitewash, the debts masked by lavish display, the rot at the heart of all they celebrated this night. As he sank to the floor, gasping, eyes bulging with the same helpless terror he had inflicted on others, Elara stood unmoving. The poison's work in him was meticulous, deliberate, cramps twisting like the overseer's whip, vision blurring as if staring into the sun-scorched fields, breath failing like the promises of freedom deferred another year. Around them, the remaining guests watched in paralyzed silence, some already feeling the echo in their own bodies, understanding at last that the feast had been seasoned with more than herbs. Lightning flared again, casting her shadow long across his writhing form, and in that instant the hall seemed to hold every scream silenced over generations. The mistress reached out a pleading hand, but withdrew it as if burned, her own lips tinged blue. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the master, watching the empire he had built on her back collapse inward, his face purpling, veins standing out like the raised scars he had ordered carved into flesh. The confrontation needed no blade, no shout, only the quiet certainty of retribution delivered at the height of his triumph, the slow mirror of suffering reflected back upon its architect while thunder drowned his final, choking plea, and the woods beyond the windows pressed their approval against the glassed in the storm-lashed aftermath. Willow Ridge Plantation lay broken open like a rotten fruit, its white columns streaked with rain and illuminated only by erratic lightning that revealed the full scope of devastation. Bodies sprawled across the banquet hall in grotesque stillness, silk and broadcloth soaked in vomit and spilled wine, the once proud tables overturned amid shards of porcelain and crystal that glittered like frost on a grave. The master's final breath had rattled out beneath Ilara's unwavering gaze, his empire reduced to a twitching corpse clutched by a weeping bride who herself slipped into silence soon after, the poison claiming every branch of the family tree in merciless succession. Hargrove the overseer, his pistol long discarded in blind panic, had fled into the night only to collapse at the edge of the cotton fields, convulsions racking his frame until the rain washed the froth from his lips. Servants scattered, some vanishing into the woods that seemed to welcome them with open arms, others cowering in the quarters as distant shouts of arriving neighbors faded beneath the storm's roar. No doctor came, the roads turned to mire, and word of the catastrophe spread slowly, warped by fear and disbelief into tales too monstrous for immediate credence. By dawn the great house stood empty of life, doors banging in the wind, fires guttered cold in the hearths. Searchers who arrived days later, sheriffs and planters from neighboring estates, found only decay accelerating under the humid air, swollen corpses already blackening, the bride's cake crawling with ants, punch bowls crusted with residue that defied easy explanation. Whispers of mass apoplexy or tainted provisions circled, but evidence dissolved in the chaos, no vials recovered, no confession extracted, the kitchen scrubbed by unseen hands before flight. Suspicion fell heaviest on the enslaved who had vanished, yet pursuit through the trackless swamps yielded nothing, the woods guarded their own. Ilara herself was never found. Some swore they glimpsed her silhouette melting into the tree line as lightning flared, apron discarded like shed skin, walking deeper into the tangle of cypress and vine where no hound could follow. The ancient hollow discovered by the poisoned survivor became a place shunned even by the boldest, relics sinking further into mud as seasons turned, voices rising on certain nights to recount the banquet in layered murmurs that chilled passers-by on distant roads. Over generations the plantation crumbled, columns toppled by kudzu, fields reclaimed by briar and marsh, the name Willow Ridge spoken only in cautionary tales told by firelight. Official records blurred the event into vague tragedy, blame scattered across bad claret or summer fever, the truth buried beneath layers of denial and rebuilt prosperity elsewhere. Yet the woods endured unchanged, their canopy a perpetual shroud whispering fragments of that wedding night, laughter turning to gasps, toasts becoming death rattles, retribution served on silver platters beneath chandelier glow. On storm-tossed evenings the murmurs swelled anew, carrying names long erased from ledgers, ensuring the horror remained alive in the dark heart of the land, a mystery coiled eternally among the roots that had nurtured both poison and justice alike.